when you're building fictional stories, any kind of fictional story, you're aiming for this level of consistency and realism that it allows another reader to sink into it utterly and believe in it, and for that consistency of experience to be so absolute that they think that the world that you're making is concrete, even though it's utter, bullshit, really. But I mean, it's an entire, you're making sort of cloud mountains, and yet, like, you're trying to make that dream space feel so real that they're sort of irrefutable, and that's kind of what I think about when I'm thinking about that sort of world building, and really and it threads through everything, honestly. I mean, it's you say world building, and then suddenly you're actually into character, you're into plot, you're into all of these other things too. It's all interthreaded, but that sense of absolute immersion and that sort of irrefutable sense that this place is real, even though it's made up.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 114 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me as always, my co-host, the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, my dear MJ Kuhn. How are you, MJ?
I am great. I still need to learn the Wookiee call. How are you?
I'll see if I can edit Jim Butcher's in. Jim Butcher did like the perfect
Jim Butcher did do a really good one.
Oh, man. Yeah. Well, if you want to support MJ, I got a book that matches her dress. Isn't that nice? If you're watching this in video, go pick up her debut novel, Among Thieves, The Blue Baby, and the sequel, Thick Ass Thieves, The Green Baby, for your double dose of fantastical thieving goodness with heists and hatchets and all that fun stuff. Go support MJ and the Thorn Food Fund.
Yes. You can also support Adrian with Mushroom Blues if you want a psychedelic detective story featuring mushrooms and cops and murder. Another cool stuff.
There we go.
Like that. Check it out.
And no version that you order will get as
if your version comes looking like that,
send it back. I will reimburse you. It's not psychedelic, I swear. As well, a quick note for everyone out there listening or watching: the official SFF Addicts Patreon and merch store are live, so check the links in the description to support what we do here. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now, joining us once again is the wonderful Paolo Bacigalupi, author of The Wind-Up Girl, The Water Knife, Novola, which is out now, and more. Welcome back, Paolo. How are you doing?
Good to be here.
Thank you for being here. We're very, very excited to get into this topic. But first, a heads up, this is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Paolo. So I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know him better. Today, we're getting deep into world building, that is, as we explore creating deep and intricate fictional worlds. Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor. 4 titans sleep beneath the earth. Only one fae can keep them from waking. Silbury is an orphan wood nymph, taken from her forest home and raised in the corrupt city of Pendurin. The Fae child grows up unaware of who she is, what she can do, and the calling of her kind. Under the control of a cruel guildmaster, Silbury is trained as an assassin. As an adult, she escapes her violent past to start a new life and a family. But a tragic death brings her back to the familiar cobbled streets to seek revenge. This dark path leads Silbury to uncover an even darker secret. An ancient evil will wake the Titans and break the world. Silbury must travel with her daughter across a war-torn land to defeat that evil. What begins as a fairy tale transforms into a sweeping, multi-generational epic about love and loss, and a woman with a strange connection to nature. The Dryad's Crown by David Hopkins is a powerful and emotional debut fantasy novel. The Dryad's Crown is available now in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. Visit dryadscrown.com to purchase the book from your favorite online retailer. And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts. So last year we did a World Building 101 masterclass with Martha Wells, but today we're going to be exploring more of the nitty-gritty of creating worlds. But Paolo, before we do that, I want to just get your general take on what the importance of world building is to you.
So I'm looking to create something that is when you're building fictional stories, any kind of fictional story, you're aiming for this level of consistency and realism that it allows another reader to sink into it utterly and believe in it, and for that consistency of experience to be so absolute that they think that the world that you're making is concrete, even though it's utter, bullshit, really. But but I mean, it's an entire, you're making sort of cloud mountains, and yet, like, you're trying to make that dream space feel so real that they're sort of irrefutable, and that's kind of what I think about when I'm thinking about that sort of world building. And really just, and it threads through everything, honestly. I mean, it's you say world building and then suddenly you're actually into character, you're into plot, you're into all of these other things too. It's all interthreaded. But that sense of absolute immersion and that sort of irrefutable sense that this place is real, even though it's made up.
And in that dream space, is it more important to kind of like set the stage a little bit more clearly, or to give the audience enough room to kind of interpret it through their own lens?
You want the edges. You want a lot of room around the edges for people to imagine. Our world is big. We don't see every detail. We reference other details. Oh, what are the French like? You make one offhand comment about what the French are like, and suddenly you know something about American culture, and you also have an idea that there's this other place called France. Like, there's a moment where the world gets bigger just from an offhand comment, and that's the kind of thing that I think of as making worlds more rich than what's actually on the page, because there's sort of a reference point that launches the reader into an imaginative space separate from what's actually specifically and literally on the page. And so there's sort of like this weird mix of, like, because you can be sort of encyclopedically sort of obsessed with detail, and that actually gives you, I think there's a Buddhist sort of phrase that has to do with the more you describe something, the less you encompass it. And that the essential nature of something is not actually what you're aiming to describe. Like when you're writing stories, you're actually trying to evoke rather than specifically describe. And so there's this point where you can kind of go down a rabbit hole of description and have left people with less than if you had only used two details. You could write a page, and you could do two details that are evocative, that kind of thing. I don't know.
No, that was
I have to tell you, like, when you asked me to, like, sort of do some sort of a masterclass thing, the first thing that I had was, let's do an imposter class. Let's do a masterclass on imposter syndrome, because I'm really fucking good at this. Like, I'm really good at feeling like, what the fuck do I know? I don't know. Like, you dangle or struggle in the weeds for a while, and hopefully you made something that people liked. Shit, like, this is hard. Like, like, oh yeah, you're the expert in characters, you're the expert in plots, you're the expert in worlds. Like, I don't know.
But it's like
how many people have that reaction when we ask for a masterclass topic, though, and it's.
But then they record with us, and they're like, "Oh, okay, this is not." What
well, that's the thing, is it's like, more than we all feel like we don't know what we're doing, but we know more than we think we do.
I think there's that sort of like that difference between sort of knowing that you figured out some things, being able to recognize the things that you figured out, being able to describe them, and then being able to instruct them, which is another art, kind of, where it's like, oh, this skill, is this transferable? Is this explainable? Like, I do believe that, like, most of writing is the acquisition of skill sets. It's not magic. It's not, oh, somebody is artistic and somebody isn't. It's people work and acquire skills, and they accrete those together in more and more skillful ways. It's carpentry, largely. There's some things that, maybe like you have an aesthetic that's interesting or whatever, but a lot of it is carpentry, but being able to instruct in carpentry is a sort of a separate thing than being able to make tables. Like be like, how do you even turn on the circular saw? Fuck if I know. Like I just do it by I do it by instinct. Yeah. So anyway, like
I would not want to approach tools like that with instinct.
Yeah, right. Let's see what happens. I don't know. Like, is this going to take off a limb? I don't know.
Oh my God.
Anyway, sorry, I digress. Go ahead.
Well, imposter syndrome aside, your novels are known for and renowned for super intricate world building. Honestly, so let's walk through your process and let's start simple, right? Let's start with how you get started. You talked about how everything is kind of braided together, which is so true, that everything kind of bleeds into itself. But do you start with a particular aspect? Do you start with geography or the culture? Is there one touchstone?
I almost always am starting with some image that's interesting to me, and then through association end up building out the world based on the starting image. So when I was writing Novella, there's the starting image of the dragon eye, which we talked about in the last episode. Like, okay, my father had a dragon eye on his desk. And that's the starting moment where I'm like, okay, so where am I? Okay, I'm in this space. I don't know anything about the world yet. I don't know, I'm not going to build that world because I don't even know where I am. I haven't discovered it yet. So for me, I need to discover that space. And what's something interesting for me to write about in any way, shape, or form? And oftentimes, the first thing that I'm looking for is just what's the nugget that's interesting. And sometimes it'll take me an entire draft of a book before I find the nugget that's interesting, and I have to throw away the book and then start over with the one piece that was good. I had to do that with the Drowned Cities, where there was literally only one line that was any good, and I'd written an entire 100,000 words that was very mediocre. And finally it was like, oh no, we're going to center back on this word. And so that actually, okay, everybody buy my book. It's called Novella. It's coming out on July 9th. It may already be out by the time you're reading this. That's the sales. Okay. Novella. It's fucking amazing. Okay.
We did it. So 8 minutes in. Boom.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. I did my job. Polly, I hope you're happy. My publicist is now content.
I'll timestamp it. It's all good.
I mean, it's just like sales pitch ad. Yeah. Perfect. So looking at the Drowned Cities, I'd written a novel and there was only one thing that was interesting in it. And so that seed's line was, there's a couple of characters are talking and they're sailing past these devastated cities. And one of the characters asked the other one, it's like, well, how did they become so wrecked? What happened here? And the other character says, well, the demagogues whipped up the people, and the people became so angry that they bit on their own tails, and they chewed until there was nothing left but the snapping of teeth. And to me, that was interesting, this idea that people had become so roiled up that they just had consumed themselves. And that's an interesting idea. I'm going to write a story about this place where everybody has just become so whipped up with rage that they've consumed themselves, that they destroyed everything. And by this time, it's so what does that feel like? Oh, that's going to be child soldiering. That's going to be people don't even remember what they're fighting over anymore. They've recruited the kids and the kids are battling it out now. Most of the adults are dead. The people who started the fight, they're all dead. What are the values that are associated with this idea? We don't know. They don't exist anymore. It's just these kids just grinding on each other still. And so then from that, so there's that node, there's that starting moment, there's a feeling that I'm just going to start to want to begin to build, and then I start building out the world from there, where I start thinking, so who are these child soldiers and what are they like? Okay, there's going to be these different factions and they're all going to sort of sound vaguely patriotic or vaguely religious, but not be attachable to any kind of sort of present day movement or anything like that. And they're going to, be very rah-rah about themselves and stuff like that. And then there's going to be so I'm talking about this place that's been consumed. So who are some of the people who are victims of this? And so I'm going to come up with, this war orphan named Malia, who's been chased by these soldier boys already. And what is she like? And it's well, world building. Okay, she's already lost a hand. They've chopped off a hand of hers already. Before the story even starts, she's already missing a hand. So this is going to tell you something about this world, the brutality of it, the consequences of it, the stakes of it. And so embodied in character is also world. And that's the kind of thing that you're kind of looking for. And her friend Mouse, who's the other kid she hangs out with, is, completely PTSD. He can't sit in enclosed spaces. He's escaped the soldier boys several times. He's hyper paranoid. paranoid. Like, so there's the two of them already are going to sort of represent some idea of what this world is, what the stakes are, where it comes from. And then you're going to let the story expand. And the story is about them hiding out in a village and them being, they actually have a term for these orphans, like these kids who've survived, and they're called war maggots. So now you're going to use language to describe who these people are. They're just like the little things that are just surviving on the dead body of this city. They're the war maggots. Okay. So there's another layer of world. And then you're going to build onto that. Like, this story is actually going to be about the soldier boys showing up at the village, and here they are again. And that's going to be your sort of inciting moment where the bad guys have showed up again. In this particular story, it happens that like and because it's about war and stuff, there's another character that I loved from Shipbreaker, and I imported him into this story, named Tool, and he's this bioengineered war beast. He's sort of a combination of human and hyena and dog and leopard, and he's just this monster. He's a perfected sort of bioengineered war monster, and so he fits thematically inside of this space. He's sort of the apotheosis of war. And these little war orphans, these two maggots, these poor war maggots, are going to encounter him. And there's going to be, throughout the story, there's going to be conversations about, violence, about when it uses, how it solves things, how it doesn't, when war is like good versus bad. Like, there's going to be all this stuff inside of the human consequences of this particular set of ongoing civil wars. And so that whole book then becomes big because of all the details, but it's also very, very tight. And it's really, really focused in. And so it's kind of like that. That's kind of what I'm doing when I'm looking at building a world. And so in almost every case, it's starting from this one starting point idea. And so in the case of like Novella, it's, this boy looking up at his father who has this dragon eye on his desk, the father who, because I read a book about Medici money, is going to be a merchant banker in a sort of Italianate Renaissance like space. So there's some setting laid into that. But like, there's a specific line that says his father traded more. He used to say he traded in goods, but more in promises. And the idea that this is going to be a story about trade, it's going to be a story about politics, it's going to be a story about relationships, all of that is going to be encompassed very quickly. And every single character after that is going to sort of embody or sort of like engage with some of those ideas that I've started out with. So it's kind of like that. I don't know. Does that?
But I love how it comes from the little details that are expounded upon.
Yeah.
And become really, really fleshed out. And I love that you provided those sort of case studies. We'll use a couple other case studies throughout the episode, but using that from your perspective, like, how does that encapsulate deep world building versus something like broad world building? Like, for everyone listening, these terms, like something as specific as deep world building might not have like a clear idea for them. Like, broad world building for me could be something like Harry Potter versus deep world building, which could be something like The Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth and everything that Tolkien created. But for you, how does your approach kind of fit into what your idea of deep world building is?
So when I think of deep world building, I'm thinking about every single layer of the story reinforcing an experience. So characters are going to reinforce that experience. The themes of the story are going to reinforce that experience. The setting is going to reinforce the feelings of that experience. The geography, values, like any component, like that, but they all end up sort of looping back and doing this sort of reinforcing thing. Really, like, non-world building is like when somebody's walking through, if somebody's named Joe Bob and he's walking around with a sword, immediately you've got a problem with like world building, right? Like, the sword is sort of like this historical object and Joe Bob comes from the South. Like, okay, so unless you're telling a very specific kind of like mashup story, these are already failing to echo and resonate with each other, and that's sort of like, so that's the sort of the joke version of not world building, right? Like, okay, you haven't thought through what kinds of people, go around with swords, or what this setting is like, or what, you've sort of failed to create consistencies already. If I'm setting it in an Italianate Renaissance world and I have, the person named Mr. Bighorn or something like that, this is going to be very odd.
Yeah.
This is not world building. We obviously know that
or
this
it's
person,
like Joe Bob the Regolai.
right? Exactly. And so some of it's just thinking in terms of like, what are the implications of what you've already built, and how do they like expand one more layer consistently? See, this is the thing where I feel like a lot of these things get fairly ephemeral, fairly quickly. Like there are things like where you're trying to create a historical story, and you start watching out for the fact that you've used, like, if you use a word like ecosystem, you've shaken your story out of the world that it was in, and because you've introduced a layer from a modern context or a modern scientific, you've introduced the idea of a modern scientific sort of analysis of the world. So if you talk about the ecosystem outside of novella, like, I know about that ecosystem, I've thought very deeply about that ecosystem, but I will never use the word ecosystem to describe, the white bark or the birds in the trees or the foxes or the tiny deer that are famous in the Rumelia or anything. I'm not going, I'm going to say that there are stone bears, and I'm going to say that there are shadow cats and these other things, but mist wolves. But those things exist out there as part of the whole of, and I'm going to build an entire philosophy around this. I'm going to say, oh, this is Firmos. This is the land where human beings don't interfere with nature, and this is the Firmos. And I'm going to build an entire philosophy that talks about Firmos versus Cambios, and Cambios is the place where human beings, it's wagon wheels, it's axles, it's fortified constructions, it's banking, all of those things, those things are going to live over here. I'm not going to say man versus nature. I'm going to say Firmos versus Cambios. I'm going to, I'm going to try to push this further into the context of this world, even as I'm describing things that I might be thinking about them from a scientific perspective of like, how does this ecosystem work? And what are the drainages that, like, what are the water courses that we would like, no, this is not this is not the language you're going to use though to describe that landscape. Daviko's going to use a different set of languages to sort of describe his landscape that he's moving through or whatever. See, now I'm rambling. See, I cannot.
No, but the rambles are good,
great.
man.
The tangents are where the good stuff is frequently. Like on everyone's interviews.
You also segued again, man.
I was just going to say, and you also set me up perfectly for what I wanted to ask next, which is, you have these different terms, these different, you're not going to necessarily describe it the way we do now. How do you keep track of all that? How do you keep track of all the details as you're writing? Do you have like a story Bible that you use? Are you
MJ's got Excel spreadsheets?
I use Excel.
Google Sheets, yeah.
Are you just a wizard? Like how?
Total wizard. Absolutely. I put on my weighted wizard. Yeah. Wizard, watch me. I rock it. I just rock it. My mind.
He takes off that hat, and there's another hat underneath.
Right. Exactly. It's very tall and pointed. So as I built the world, a lot of this stuff you're building it off the cuff, and then there's this moment when you're like, shit, I forgot the name of that god. Or, oh, wait, was it Meridia or Cerulia who's the daughter of Arulo and Arula, these two other gods? And like, oh, shit, I need to like start. And so then I start building, I've basically got these files, which are, it's all in Scrivener. And so I just have basically a world section set apart in the research area of Scrivener where it's like, okay, here's, a listing of all the gods. Here's a listing of, myths. Here's a listing of common sayings. Here's a listing of, and I'll have some of that, stuff available as reference. But it's not extensive. A lot of it is, part of it is just if you live enough in a space, you really are, living in it. And so, like, sometimes I'll have to go back and check, and sometimes it's not even the thing that I think I need to check is the thing I end up having to check. It's like, oh shit, I had that one offhand. Are they saying spikulo or like what is the word that they use? And I realized I haven't made a list of curse words, so I have to go back and see if I can find all the curse words that I've made up and insert those. Oh, this is this person's a Connie Sphincto. Okay, great. This is like this.
Yeah.
dog anus. Like
I made that for my book, and then I just fucking threw it in there because
I love it. Like, so I was asked actually if I would like do like some cast of characters and some glossaries and stuff like that, and I didn't. And I actually wonder whether it was like that's just a bridge too far. I've got notes, but it's like another thing I have to look at and edit and then make sure it's correct. And I was like, I don't want to do it. Like it's hard enough to get through copy edits. Like,
you missed your chance.
Yeah. Copy edits are always.
yeah. So. But yeah, so I have some reference stuff, but I don't build that stuff extensively. Mostly, the stuff that I'm exploring or building is getting laced directly into the world.
Yeah, because Luke, our patron Luke Shepard, who asked a question last episode, but he asked another one that was referring to your future, like near future Earth books. Like Wind Up Girl, Water Knife, Shipbreaker, all these books. How for him they felt so real and lived in, and how the socio-political present and past are extremely fleshed out. He was imagining that you have actual textbooks of the world's histories lying on your desk, like some Oxford scholar.
Right. The tome, a couple of tomes, like the history of the 22nd century in Bangkok. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and that I think that's the thing is if you make the right references, as you're going through and you're writing a story, if you make the right sort of very offhand references in some cases, oh, there's devastation up in the north, or oh, have you been up in those forests? And 2 times if characters like refer to like some devastation in the north, you start believing that there's some devastation in the north. I don't have to go up there. Like, oh, there was this war on the the Vietnamese border or whatever. Oh, there's stuff happening. Oh, somebody came out of there. Oh, they're a war refugee out of there. I don't need to go into much more detail than that because you start imagining it. If I give you one more detail, you think that there's a long history there. If I give you, and that's part of that big illusion that you're working on building, is that these offhand references that are, sort of the fuzzy edges of the story then make the story feel so big. And really satisfying because the reader is actually doing all that work. They're doing huge amounts of fill-in work. So yeah, you're like, no, the stuff that's in the text is exactly what I know about this world. Like there's nothing, I haven't built a timeline. I haven't built, like, if I said it, it exists. Otherwise, like it probably doesn't exist in any notation or anything else. But like, internally as you're reading the document, if it sounds consistent there, then it's going to allow the reader to build in all the rest. So.
Is that kind of how you would approach like deep world building, excuse me, on Earth, with locations that readers are already familiar with? Like, is it best to kind of let those fuzzy edges exist and then try to focus in as much as possible? Or
I only explore as far as I'm interested. That's kind of the way that, like, so like when I'm writing novella, I want to reference that Zaroom is off in the distance. There's a lot of sand out there. There's some cliffs that maybe a dragon used to perch upon. And there was a really jackass sultan out there because Aga Khan came from there. And he mentions that he didn't like the sultan or the sultan's children. That's what you know. But you've got sand, you've got a sultan, you've got maybe some dragons in the past, and some cliffs, and and you've got Aga Khan, who's this very honorable soldier. That's what you've got. Like everything else, you're going to fill in. But those are the parts that were interesting to me about it. I'm not going to fill in any more than that. When we're setting something, like, I think like the weird thing about world building is like we're any story that you tell is world building, right? Like if you tell a noir story, is it going to be set in the daylight? It's better if it's set in the twilight. Like, is it going to be, is there going to be is everybody going to be a non-smoker, or is everybody going to be a smoker? Probably everybody's going to be a smoker. Like, there's just things that like are automatically going to help do what the story is promising to do. Oh, this is a very dark, broken, people are going to do bad things to one another. Like, okay. And these stories, they all are world building. If you're writing a novel of, suburban, sort of malaise, you're probably going to have manicured lawns and people drinking at 5, whatever the thing is, like, it's all world building. It's all reinforcing. But when you're doing it with fantasy, you're just making it more of the details.
Yeah. Like, could you imagine Blade Runner without rain?
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. Or if it took place in daylight, it's all in darkness. It's all
then
at
that
night.
like classic line, it would be like tears and sunshine. It's like that shit doesn't
Right.
work.
Yeah. No,
Doesn't work.
and
well, speaking of the details, I think that's a big piece of creating a world that feels really lived in, right? Is the small little everyday details that exist in these worlds. How do you go about creating those small little details?
I think that the small details, they come from two things normally. I bring them and normally it's going to always start from environment. So environment leads to characters, is going to lead to so yeah, you're building ground up basically. So your environment is going to influence your characters. It's going to influence your environment is going to influence the way that settlement patterns happen, the way that building happens, the way that culture happens, the way that characters exist, the way that they speak about their world. And the way that and then on top of that is going to be the plots that they have are all going to be set on top of that stack basically. So if you understand those layers of your world, then when the character is doing something, it's going to feel consistent top to bottom, basically. So, if I'm building this Italian Renaissance world or whatever, it's going to be, and I know that this is a place of trade. The city is going to be set on the ocean. So now I've got Novola. It's sitting by the ocean. It's on a river as well for trade. And so you've got the ocean, you've got the Remilia, which is the big mountains off to the west of Novola, and you've got the ocean to the east, and you've got sailing ships going in and out, all of the trade happening, and trade going up and down the river to another city called Party. And so we got this trade space. Like we know that we know that cities mostly get settled on coastlines or rivers. Like that's where they go. So anything else than that, and you sort of need an explanation. It's better be on an oasis or something. Water matters. Like these things, and the world that you build, like from a desert city set it on an oasis, is going to change the way that everybody talks about their landscape, and the metaphors that they use are going to be different. Like something unpleasant for one person might be, sticking your hand into sea urchins if you're by the ocean, and it's going to be like eating sand if you live in the desert. Those are both, metaphors for unpleasantness, but they're going to be grounded in their physical spaces. And that's what I mean by like sort of like your characters on top of this whole stack of other things. And so, but then like also like if we're going to like, if I'm talking about Novola and it being a place of trade, then what's the language that they use to talk about trade? Oh, Parlo Banco, we're going to negotiate across the plank. And then what are traders obsessed with? They're getting the best deal. So, okay, so Novelese people are famous for getting the best deal. They're famous for getting the best deal. They're famous for being obsessed with their gold. They're famous for being like wealthy and merchant bankers and stuff like that. And so then how do other people talk about the Novelese? Oh yeah, those people are so twisted. Those people are like just all they care about is gold. All they, and you're going to start like having these things where it's like, oh, the person from Marai, or the person from Basuna, or the person from Torayama or Gavazzo is going to always say, "Oh yeah, we know you Novelese people. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You guys, you love Faccio Scuro, which basically to everybody else means you're so two-faced.
Yeah.
Like, the Novelese are like, we are Faccio Scuro. You cannot read us. It's like we make excellent business decisions and we are always on top. And everybody else is like, they're two-faced bastards who always fuck you over. Like, so then you suddenly that the Novelese are as twisted as their women's hair. That's a saying that like, comes into play, where other people are talking about what the Novelese are like. And so you can play on like, okay, this starting point of them being a trading city and a trading culture, and then a negotiating culture, and then you can expand that into like, what do they say about themselves, and what do other people say about them? And again, like you're sort of building that stack. And so then on the top of that, very top of that stack, is your plot, right? So you've got Davico, who is not very good at Faccio Scuro and not very good at, he is Faccio Chiaro. People can read him. He's easily fooled. He is the innocent. And so now you've got like this entire stack of culture focused around the idea of wise and thoughtful negotiation and skillful negotiation. And this guy he's a rube, he's a sucker. And And he's also supposed to inherit the most powerful merchant banking empire in his known world. So that so by building the culture and by building the language and by building the whole understanding for the reader about what this place is and what the values of these people are and the dynamics of their city, when you get the plot going and there's this idea that this young boy who is being forced into a role that he doesn't belong in and who he's not suited for, his soul is not suited for this. He's comfortable out in the wilderness. He's comfortable out in Firmos, riding his pony, hanging out with his dog. Like, those are the things that he where his soul is filled, and yet he's supposed to matter in this space. You believe in the space that's dangerous over here, Novella, with all of its plots and schemes. And you also believe in Daviko a little bit more. And you also see the inherent plot conflict that's going to develop, and you believe in it more. And that's kind of what the whole, stack is meant to be, is that kind of a, I don't know, synergistic sort of design.
Yeah, but at the same, like, yes, very much so. I really like the point that you brought up about like another culture and how they perceive, because it's like you described the stacks very well. It's like, but the thing is, you can have multiple stacks, lined up next to each other, and they are able to think of themselves in certain ways and also judge people. Because I have a friend who's from Positano. And talking to his dad is like a very, like very proud Napolitano. And the way that he talks about other.
Oh man.
The way he talks about like Romans, the way he talks about like.
Oh, they will talk so much trash.
Oh my God, it's amazing. It's amazing. But I can't imagine what it was like back in the days of like city states where there was a legitimate separation of state between all of these different cities and regions, and they were legitimately like building their identities around like Florence, around Naples, around Rome, around Bologna, and judging each other and having perceptions of each other in terms of like, you're fucking two-faced, man. Like,
right. And you see that, you see that play out in every culture, like how do Northerners talk about Southerners in the United States?
How do Canadians talk about Americans?
Right. And how do Americans talk about Canadians?
Not well.
And no, I mean, and in every stage you kind of see those dynamics. When I was living in China, it was really fascinating to like listen to how a Beijing person would talk about a Shanghai person, vice versa. Like, whoa, man, like you'd be up in Beijing and you're like, I'm going to Shanghai, and the Beijingers would be like, oh, those people, they're terrible. Also, their food is terrible. And then you get
everything about them is terrible.
And then you get down to Shanghai and they're like, how did you like survive living amongst Beijingers? You poor soul. Like, what were you doing? Like, and then you get over to Sichuan and they're just like, the Beijing people, like all they do is drink like, jasmine tea. They ruin tea. Like all they do is ruin tea. And like, every place you go, like there were like these regional sort of like regionally specific sort of, how they think of themselves and how they talk of themselves. And then also how they talk about others. And and you can harvest those details and harvest those behaviors and then incorporate them into your world to make them more specific and make it feel more lived in and stuff. Yeah.
Those are like the kinds of things that I just absolutely adore. And something I wanted to ask you about, because you brought up your YA at the top of the episode, but when it comes to YA versus adult fiction, like, do you approach your world building differently when you're writing for a younger audience, or is it kind of like same approach but different sort of like writing style, or how do you handle that?
Thing. It's the absolute same thing. There's no difference. When I wrote Zombie Baseball Beatdown, you're still building an information stack. You're still building this culture. You're still building these characters. You're still building this world. You're still building like the only difference with all of these things is that you have to understand who you're giving the gift of story to. And so if I'm writing for a fifth grader who's a reluctant reader, like, that's not probably the person I'm going to give the gift of story to in the form of like, a 10-page digression into the myth of Aristea. That's probably not the play. Like, I'm probably going to be more like, okay, so what are you interested in, and how do you talk about your world, and how do you engage with it? And so how can I, I'm going to speak with you. I'm going to talk to you. And we do this all the time, right? We code switch all the time, right? Like how do you talk to your parent versus how do you talk to your spouse? How do you talk to a little kid versus how do you talk to an elder? Like we do this all the time. It's the same exact thing. Like, there's this idea, like oftentimes, like, very bad writers will have this idea like, oh, so I understand, you just make it more simple, or you make it more like, you make it go faster, or you make it more, and you're like, no, you make it more specific. You make it more specific to the person you're trying to speak to and communicate to. And that tells you what stays in and what stays out and what part gets emphasized. But it's not, but all of the details of that thing are exactly the same. Like you still are building the same idea of like a highly consistent world that this reader will be able to completely engage with and believe in. And yeah, that stuff is, there's almost no variation. Like the world in Shipbreaker, Drowned Cities, Tool of War is entirely as sort of laid out in my own head and is built up in my own head as Wind Up Girl. There's a history, there's layers, there's political dynamics, there's all that kind of stuff, right? That it's it's mostly, it might be it's all just, you're just changing your the way you're delivering the experience so that reader feels connected to.
Is that delivery similar for short stories then? Because it's like with short fiction, like I don't dabble too much into it, but it's like the limited word count restricts you in a lot of ways, but it also gives you certain kinds of freedoms. But world building is one of those things that it's like, how much world building do you infuse into a piece of short fiction such that you can create like
that would be
believable, fully realized world,
No, it's different. Like, so the only thing really, God, like, so one thing, like, so when you're talking to different age groups, the difference is how you talk. Right. Okay. If I'm going to talk to a little kid and like, I'm like, hey, how's it going? I'm going to change my voice. I'm going to like use different words, right? I'm going to do all sorts of stuff. If I'm talking to a grandparent, there's going to be a more formal thing and I'm not going to curse as much, right? That's like you talking to somebody, right? That's not about the world.
Much. I'm still going to swear, but just not as
right.
Maybe, you back.
Like, I'll probably curse with the little kid more than no. It's like, when you're working with short fiction, you aren't thinking about. So I tend to think it's actually a really interesting exercise to try to build a story. Like, what's the novel version? Like, a lot of times when I was working on short stories, especially, I was trying to explore a specific idea. So I want to explore the idea of endocrine disruptors, or I want to explore the idea of corporate control of food or whatever. And then, but if you want to explore that idea in 3,000 words, that's going to be different than how you explore the idea in 11,000 words. And that's going to be completely different from the way you explore the idea at 120,000 words. But the world and the story still have to feel rich and real and grounded. And so more likely what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up simplifying things like plot. You're going to end up simplifying the number of characters involved. You're going to end up simplifying. There are other things that you simplify because the world has to explain the concept. Like, okay, I'm going to talk about endocrine disruptors and I'm going to do it in 3,000 words. Okay. Like, how are we going to do this? It's like, okay, I'm going to pick one specific conflict, which is about like how it might affect childbirth or how it might affect newborns. And we're going to, that's like, how are we going to focus in on this? It's like, I've only got 3 scenes to do this, basically. So I've got one scene of a birthing. I've got one scene where the doctor is thinking about something else, and then another birthing scene. That's all I've got. Those are going to be really richly built scenes. Each one of them is going to have about 1,000 words, So like, I've got a fair amount of space to like do some setting, change the way that they use their dialogue, focus in on like, the dynamics of like, oh, if I have a brief moment on a commuter train where everybody's wearing filter masks against the pollutants, that's going to give you some of that world. it's only going to be, it might only be 100 words or 150 words out of the total budget that you have, but it's going to explain that this is a polluted world. Those things are, the world still stays as rich. The other things are what you end up simplifying down to. So you have a single tight experience versus a slightly wider experience. And so you're just going to reduce other kinds of complexities. And yeah, there's some stripping down, but that stuff, like, it would be, I mean, and you can read, something like Pump Six, or I had to write a story recently, a little while ago, for MIT Technology Review, and it was about climate change. It was a couple of years ago, and it was just, I had about 3,000 words, I think, and it was like, okay, I'm going to carry this character through 5 different climate disasters, and it's going to take this form of like, and so I'm going to maybe change the narrative structure. I'm not going to illustrate every scene. Maybe I'm going to narrate more scenes. And she arrived in Miami, and the kids at school were okay, but they taught her curse words, and then and she managed to find a music tutor who was really cool, and then the hurricane hit. And they watched cars like bounce down the road, like floating, like leaves or whatever. And there's your detail, and then they actually ended up living in the apartment longer while the mold grew on the walls. And you've got enough details, and that's an oversimplification of what it is. But you can narrate instead of dramatizing. And so you're going to pick maybe the specific scene you dramatize slightly differently, or dramatize slightly differently, or whatever. But all the world still feels rich, even at 3,000 words. There's just methodologies to attack that same problem again and again. Like, you just stay more focused.
Yeah, you got to use specific tools in your carpentry toolkit.
Yes, in your writer toolbox.
Mm-hmm.
And it is really interesting to like try to write the same story like in 3 different lengths. Like, it's fascinating. Like the same feeling, not the same story, but the same experience, the same feeling, or the same message. To try to do that at different lengths to see what can fit in and what can't fit in. And it's a fascinating exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, kind of riffing on that a little bit, I want to talk a little bit kind of about maybe the flip side of that concept, where it's, world building can, I feel like people are often concerned, at least writers are, that their world building may be overshadowing other elements of their storytelling, especially if they have a really complex world that they've created. What is your advice, just kind of to bring us home here, about creating a world that's really rich, really deep, but enhances rather than overwhelms your narratives?
I think that the way to do that is that all that information needs to be threaded through story. Like, what are the politics of this world? If the politics of this world matter, then the politics of this world matter to these specific characters, and these specific characters can talk about it. In fact, it's probably going to matter to the plot as well. Like, it's, you're looking to thread the things together so that each component is doing more than one job. Like, your plot should be doing world building. Your characters themselves should be part of that world. Like, the minute, like, so in Novella, like the minute I introduce a character like Cazzetta, who's a stilettatore, right? I've done world building without ever having to say, I don't have to say there are assassins. I don't have to say that this is an Italianate world. I don't have to say I've built a word called stilettatore. And apparently a lot of people have stilettatore. Oh, this is the family's stilettatore. Okay, so now what do you know? Like, that the politics matters, and that they have assassins, and a name of them, and it's got a resonance of Italy or the Renaissance or stilettos.
Hopefully they're thinking about the knives as opposed to the high heels.
Right, exactly. Perfect. Yeah. Oh, Cazzetta going off to a murder.
It's like the worst assassin ever.
It's a very adept assassin. Yeah.
I love that. That would be so fucking awesome, because I love that.
The high heel assassin.
Here I come. Slow down. I need to stick you with my high heel. Those things, if you find you're looking for ways to embed those details and embed that the rules of the world inside of all of the other components. If it's standout, like, if you have to do an entire treatise on like, well, in the history of blah blah blah, there were the 5 kingdoms, and the 5 kingdoms were blah blah blah. Like you've already kind of lost the thread, because it's no longer you aren't stacking enough things together. And I think that's kind of the key, is to look for ways to stack where either your plot or your characters or your setting are doing, and all of those things are doing a little bit of the world building in dribs and drabs, and that it all ends up becoming sort of more of an embroidered sort of whole, rather than individual chunks of, here's the information for how the world works, or here's the information for how the magic works, or here's the information. You imagine you're building a story where there's some sort of like strange magic system, and your first scene is going to be like, absolutely, we're going to see the character use some magic, and we're going to see some consequence of the magic, we're going to see a cost of the magic, and we're going to see that it also is going to create a problem for them that they have to move on to the next scene. Like, okay, you're doing world building around magic and your magic quote system, but you haven't ever said, here's my magic system. You've just said, oh, they summoned the demon. Oh, and the demon got hold of the child and ate it, and now they're on the run. Whatever, I don't know. But the idea is that like you're going to be describing your magic system without ever telling what the magic system is exactly, and because it's doing things in every single layer of the story, it becomes rich without you ever having to like say, I'm making something really rich here. I don't know. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure that answers the
That
question.
totally does. And I think that leaves us with like a really good finishing piece of advice about the stacking. Like, it all comes down to stacking and making sure that every element contributes to every other element, and then you'll know. Yeah.
And your story cake.
Your story cake.
I kept imagining cakes when you were talking about them.
Yeah, nice. I
approve.
I'm like, this cake is getting so delicious. And on that delicious note, Paolo, thank you so much for doing this masterclass with us, for digging deep into world building, and just
instead of imposter syndrome aside,
defeating your imposter syndrome for
there
one episode.
Yeah. One episode at a time, little bit.
One episode at a time.
Yeah. This was fun.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, that is it for this mini masterclass and our 2-parter with Paolo. Paolo, if you could let folks know where they can find you online.
Yeah, you can find me at windupstories.com, and if you search for Paolo Bacigalupi, you can probably find me on Blue Sky as well. And
go pick up Paolo's books if you're in the mood for YA or near future sci-fi or an Italian
middle
Renaissance
grade,
fantasy
or anything. Yeah,
Novella.
Exactly. Like,
you got options.
I've wandered in every single direction. Yeah, novella though. Yeah, the one that my publicist wants me to talk about.
That one
with a heavy emphasis on novella.
Yeah, I should have a book to wave in front of it, but hey,
I'll just like overlay one in front of your
we'll
face.
digitize
perfect.
one.
Perfect. Just fantastic. Do it. Absolutely.
Time
Flash.
Stamps,
like,
Polly,
time
right. Well, you can also follow SFF Addicts on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, all that jazz at sffaddictspod. You can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. If you want some fungal noir, you can go read my debut novel, Mushroom Blues. MJ, what about you?
Yep, you can find me across all the main socials, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, everything at MJ Kuhn Books, or just go to mjkuhn.com and you can check out my books, Among Thieves and Thick as Thieves, wherever books are sold. So there you go. Getting excited.
And go feed Thorin. He's a hungry cat. Thorin Food Fund.
Thorin Food Fund.
Thank you all for listening. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.